All right, well, we better get started then. Welcome. Regional Planning Commission, Wednesday, May 22nd edition. Can I have a roll call, please?
Peter Gower,
Here.
Sarah Chavilicek,
Here.
James Barnes,
Here.
Larry Chesney,
Here.
James Fewens,
Here.
Ed Hawkins,
Here.
Frank Peterson,
Here.
Diane Vanderwell,
Here.
and Kevin Weisky.
Here.
Thank you. How about a salute to the flag? And Commissioner Weisky, since you're ready to go this evening, why don't you lead us?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Wonderful, thank you. Have a motion to approve the agenda, please.
Move to approve.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Okay, motion carries. We'll move on then to public comment. Do we have any general public comment?
I have none this evening.
Okay, great. And we will move on then to our business of the day, 5A, which we are lucky to have a presentation about regional strategy for housing affordability.
Mr. Chair, if I may start.
Yes, Ms. Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to give the introduction to this presentation, and you must have been looking at my notes because it says tonight we are lucky to have Enterprise with us to present their findings and suggestions on housing affordability in the Truckee Meadows. Enterprise has previously completed a needs analysis and a community profile for our area and shared those results with the Planning Commission at previous meetings. Tonight, Enterprise will be sharing the results of the work of many months, many brains, and many hands, specifically on tools and timeline options for a strategy for our community. The myriad number of options listed in this document means that there is choice for the jurisdictions and implementing agencies. We need to work together as a community to determine what strategies can work here for all of us. The RPC is being asked tonight to hear this presentation, accept the report, and provide any feedback desired, including any that you might consider to be useful tomorrow when the same presentation is given to the Regional Planning Governing Board and their discussion. Fundamentally, tonight is the opportunity for the RPC to hear the work that Enterprise has done on housing affordability. I'm now going to turn this over to Chris and Ann from Enterprise, and they're going to take it away and be amazing.
All right. Good afternoon, good evening. Chris Kizzy, Enterprise Community Partners. First of all, I'm happy to be here to kind of bring everyone up to speed on the great work that the community has contributed to. And I think you'll find that a lot of the actions and recommendations in this report are, one, actionable, and two, reflect the feedback and the collective feedback from the groups and community partners that we've been engaged with throughout this entire process. And so we're excited to share that with you and excited to see the region move forward. Long before Ann and I have been coming to Truckee Meadows, Enterprise has been a long-standing investor in the state of Nevada through capital solutions like low-income housing tax credit, new market tax credits. So I wanted to kind of highlight that for you because I think it's not just Ann and I that are representing Enterprise, as we're also bringing our solutions, our policy lens, as well as our capital to the state of Nevada as well. Just a reminder about this process. This process started back in January 2017 with a housing forum with over 100 stakeholders that participated in that forum. And there was a really call to action. They wanted to see not just a plan, but a plan that was implementable. So you'll see a lot of the framing in the strategy roadmap reflects action and actions that the region can move forward and advance. And those actions have been informed by a planning structure that was specifically established of a cross-sector of stakeholders, elected officials, and representatives of public staff to inform these actions that you'll see in the plan. And so all of that has been collected and provided in the plan. As Kim mentioned, we started off with a needs assessment to better understand not only the conditions of housing affordability in the region today, but also what those projections look like in the future. So we're establishing a plan that not only addresses the existing conditions, but as well as future trends and conditions as well. These actions that you'll see in this plan have been vetted by that planning structure for the past several months. What you'll see now in the final product, which we're calling Housing Our Future, is really putting narrative behind the why, the how, and the where that these actions can be implemented, and you'll see that reflected in here as well. As I mentioned, this has been a heavily involved and engaged process with various community members. We've had 18 working group and executive leadership team meetings throughout this process over these last 15, 18 months. We've had about 40 or so one-on-one meetings with elected officials, industry groups, and other community leaders as well, and their feedback is also reflected in this document. Over 130 responses to surveys, 115 participants in various community conversations throughout this process, and over 10 presentations similar to the ones we're giving today, updating RPC and RPGB about our process and actions and recommendations throughout this entire process. Just to remind you of who made up our planning structure, both the executive leadership team as well as our public staff working group and community leaders working group. And you'll see the cross-sector reflected of perspectives and stakeholders that you'll see also reflected in the document. Early on in this process, just to remind you, we first established a vision working with the planning structure to make sure that we're all working towards a common goal at the end of a 10-year period. And that vision, I think, reflects that feedback that all residents of Truckee Meadows should have access to a continuum of safe, accessible, and affordable housing options in neighborhoods that offer access to opportunity and a high quality of life. And then we also established principles to make sure that the actions and policy recommendations and funding recommendations and targeting reflect that vision. And so all these core principles have been used to vet every single action that we've developed to make sure it responds and also supports that vision, that broader vision that was established by the planning structure. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ann to walk us through some of the regional needs and capacity to respond that we've identified throughout this process.
Good evening, everyone. So the first step once we had that planning structure was, as Chris said, digging in on these housing needs. I think we have talked about these with you all a bit, so I'll try to go at the high level, but a lot more detail goes behind this in the community profile document that you should all have received copies of, and if not, we have more available. So the 5 key housing issues that really organize the strategy roadmap are reflective of not only hyper-local trends and submarket conditions, but also are really driven by some national macroeconomic trends that we observe in every community in which we work with. So up first is this shortage of affordable rental units, particularly for households earning less than half of area median income, which in Truckee Meadows is about $34,000 a year. And that's really compounded by some of these later trends. So thinking about how supply has not necessarily kept up with some major demographic shifts that have changed what demand looks like for housing in Truckee Meadows and beyond. So thinking about the aging population, more millennials waiting longer to start families. So we're seeing demand for smaller housing units and more diverse types of units in general outside of the traditional single-family home model. We also know that wages across the nation, when you adjust for inflation, have been relatively stagnant, while housing costs have been increasing pretty rapidly, particularly when you look at specific submarkets within the Truckee Meadows. These are really starting to take off, meaning many households are paying too much of their income on housing costs. Keeping in mind, it's also gotten more expensive to build housing, so construction costs are high right now, labor is hard to come by, land is at a premium, making it even more important to preserve the affordability that does exist in the region today, whether that's due to market conditions or the condition of the property, or because of affordability restrictions. And it's important to note that some of these restrictions could be lost in the next 10 years, so we've included some strategies about preserving those, as well as ensure that you're maintaining the quality of that stock as you're preserving its affordability. And then finally, thinking about the households that, as they're paying so much of their income on housing costs, as the costs change, they're facing more displacement pressures than ever before. So making sure that residents are supported while properties are also being preserved. Let's see here. So we also took a look, as you may recall, this slide has been around with us from very early on, thinking about what is the region's current capacity today to respond to this myriad of challenges. It's a daunting picture, but we know that there are many strengths that exist in the community before this planning process even began. So we made sure that the strategy roadmap accounted for those strengths already today, looked at opportunities that are coming into the region, but also made sure to think about opportunities to build from weaknesses and also be more proactive about some potential threats to think about how those could be turned into opportunities as well. So that is how we got to the strategy roadmap. So I'll be going into a little bit about the structure and how we organize the strategy roadmap, and then Chris will be digging in on the specific actions within each of these after this. So the overview here is, again, a big focus on building access to opportunity. We did a detailed analysis of access to opportunity along some of these core dimensions around access to jobs and transit, quality of education, existing health outcomes, to make sure that all of these strategies not only just increase the supply, affordability, safety, and availability of housing, but also make sure they're really achieving the broader outcomes the community has articulated they would like to see through this effort. So within that, we have 35 different actions in this strategy. 10 of them are what we've called cross-cutting actions, focused more broadly on building the region's housing toolbox and general capacity for implementation, while 25 are organized around those 5 key housing issues, so really tailored against those. And they'll really leverage that increased capacity towards that. So these are those 5 strategy focus areas. They are not in priority order. They are just numbered, so it's easier to talk about them. But they are, and I think it's actually important to talk about the need to pursue each of these 5 things. Pursuing production alone will not get you so far if you're also losing affordability on the other end. So preservation is a critical component, making sure that people are a part of this process through the protection from displacement, while you're also supporting the development side, equally important. So just a note, these are the 5 around production, diversifying the housing stock, expanding access to homeownership opportunities, preserving affordability, and protecting quality, and then protecting residents from displacement. So to kind of zoom out, within those 35 actions, we talked about a lot of different tools that could be used in the region, some of which are present to a certain extent today, but could be expanded or used slightly differently, some of which would be new entirely, as well as some new programs, some of which may have previously existed, or there's just a gap today in filling these needs. So this is a representation of where those tools and programs come from. Again, this is a selection for the different jurisdictions and their partners to think through how can we better address our challenges by just having a wider range of tools to pull from. So that's why I wanted to make sure we pulled these out for your consideration, and so you can see that these don't get lost within those 35 actions, because they often end up supporting more than just one direct action. And then, as I mentioned, we know that a one-size-fit-all approach never works, no matter where we are, especially in a region like this one. So we dug in on those submarket conditions, looking at census tract by census tract, the different conditions around the housing stock, what affordability looks like today, how investments have been changing, and again, access to opportunity, leveraging enterprises' proprietary data on opportunity captured in Opportunity 360. So that this represents these kind of just an illustration of the maps. We're not expecting you to be able to see each and every one of them. But they are all contained in the draft document of the strategy roadmap. And they just reflect where, based off of all the feedback we've received from stakeholders, it makes sense to prioritize these different strategy focus areas to yield the greatest impact. So looking across all these things, where are you likely to get the most bang for your buck for certain investments or deploying certain tools? So with that, I'll hand things back over to Chris to talk about the specific actions in the roadmap.
So as Ann mentioned, one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that we're not putting too much on the region too soon. And so each of these actions that I'm going to go through, and I won't go through them all, I'll highlight a couple of them, are sequenced in the actual strategy roadmap so that they're leveraging both the increased capacity, but the increased resources that are developed over time to allow for implementation to support these specific actions. And so there's a lot of sequencing that's involved with this. We recognize where the region is today versus where they want to be 10 years from now. And so we've sequenced these actions to reflect not only the incremental building of that capacity, but also the incremental building of resources to then take on various actions over time. And so you won't see that sequencing reflected here, but it is reflected in the actual strategy document. So again, I think these actions are really reflective of the 5 core issues. So you'll see the one-to-one between the 5 issues that Ann highlighted, as well as the 5 strategy focus areas. So in terms of supporting broader production of more affordable rental housing throughout the region, particularly for low-income households. So Ann mentioned there's a supply gap, roughly about 12,000 units That's particularly for households earning about 50% AMI and below. And so how do you support more production of affordable rental housing for that income population? And we know that there's a variety of things that you can do, both supporting lower cost housing types, improving your ability to actually finance more development. And so tools like the Regional Housing Trust Fund become an important tool across the region to support broader development of affordable housing. And so that's why we wanted to lead with that one, because I think there's been ongoing conversation already to advance that conversation moving forward. And I think that's an exciting point to be at for the region from where we were 2 years ago, that conversation has advanced to the point where now they're talking about various ways to fund that Regional Housing Trust Fund. And that's something that I think a lot of communities across the country are starting to develop locally and to pour local resources into that, because they're recognizing the tool that could help spur more development and specifically have control over what types of development you want to see. And so this is strongly connected to many of the other strategy focus areas as well. Another one I want to highlight is to expand the development capacity of the Regional Housing Authority to support development throughout the region. We know that they're slowly starting to take on more development capacity. I think having more mission-oriented nonprofit developers in the region is important to support development of lower-income housing. And so expanding the capacity of RHA to do that, we attended a groundbreaking yesterday. That was really exciting to see that project come to fruition. And so we want to see more of that, and I think more expanded resources allows more broader development, particularly for affordable rental housing. The other thing that I think we were asked to look at by the city of Reno was inclusionary housing and how can we develop incentives in various submarkets, recognizing, as Ann said, not every market throughout the region is created equal, and how can we, recognizing some of the limited resources that how can we create incentives to support development, including affordable housing in market rate developments. And so looking at where there's feasibility in the market to support something like that is something that we know is a long-term conversation, and so that's something that we've sequenced towards the latter end of the 10 years, recognizing that there's a lot of conversations that have to be had to achieve that objective. And so that's kind of reflected in that sequencing that you'll see as well. And I think what you'll see here is also the kind of bringing in kind of the where, recognizing that there needs to be some geographic prioritization and targeting with a variety of these actions. And so we've identified where some of those sub-market conditions are primed to implement some of these actions as well. And then similar to supporting broader affordable development is how do we also include a more diverse type of housing product in the market. So recognizing that majority of homes are single-family units throughout the region, and recognizing that there's this demand for more diverse housing products. So we have about five actions focused on bringing diverse housing products to the market. And so a couple that I'll highlight is looking at how do we develop a pilot program that supports development of diverse, lower-cost housing products across the region. One of the things that we've heard is that sometimes you just need to see it happen, and then I think there'll be more demand for that product and also more support for developing that product. And so maybe establishing a pilot program to show that, one, it can work, both from a financial aspect, but also from a demand aspect, is something that we think would be a great launching pad for that. The other thing that we've heard also is that there's limited resources in the region. I think that's a well-known fact. And so how do you bring more resources to a region, and how do you leverage some of the existing tools that are currently available to the region that aren't being accessed today? And so one of those tools is Section 108 financing. And the region could access about $12 million in Section 108 financing to pursue mixed-use, mixed-income development. And that's something that we also heard from both development community as well as key stakeholders, that there's a demand for that product, and having a financing mechanism that strongly supports that is something that the region could access relatively quickly. Also thinking about home ownership and the need for home ownership, recognizing there's a tight rental market, but there's some renters that are maybe low income, but also might be primed for moving on to home ownership. And so recognizing that there's several actions that the region could take to support broader access to home ownership. Keeping in mind that you want to factor in access to opportunity in that conversation. And so recognizing that not every submarket is created equal, and that by concentrating, low-income housing in certain areas won't be the best approach. And so how do you establish a regional down payment assistance program that accounts for those various sub-market conditions and allows families and households choice where they want to start a home ownership path? And so establishing a regional down payment assistance program that leverages both the current capacity in the region, but also the capacity at the state level as well is something that I think will provide more access to home ownership. And then two, I know there's been a lot of great progress with the community land trusts with the development on Sage Street. And I think looking at that model to say, how can we turn that model and really leverage that for home ownership to increase access to home ownership as well is something that the region could move forward with. And I think we've had a lot of conversations about Community Foundation taking on that role as well. And I think there's some interest there. And so they've taken a close look at this action and actually provided some insight on that. And so there's a lot of support for that as well. As Ann mentioned, preservation is critical in the region as well. There's thousands of units that could be lost over the next 10 years if action is not taken. And so how do we make sure we're building some infrastructure to support that, to make sure that there's some intervention that goes on to ensure that those units stay in the market for affordability and that they're preserved long term. And so building the actions around that, I think, there's multifaceted action that you could take. We know that the region is moving forth with some PACE legislation to kind of mirror what's happening in Clark County. And that provides a great financing tool to come in and upgrade some of those properties, the major systems in those properties, to then lower the cost of operating those properties, which in turn lowers the rent for specific renters. And that's something that we've seen across the country as a best practice that's moving forward. So it's exciting to see the region move forward with that as well. One of the things we also understand is that you need to get a handle on where these properties are, who owns them, and what the capital needs of those projects are, and so that you can start to begin to align financing with that. So establishing something like a early warning preservation system to flag when those properties could be coming out of their affordability period, and then aligning some financing to intervene where necessary to make sure that those properties stay in the inventory of affordability. And then finally, recognizing that the trends are shaping up that is continuing to be households are continue to be at risk for displacement as the market continues to grow. And so how do you ensure that you have some protections in place for existing renters that live, work, and play in the Truckee Meadows, that there's an opportunity for them to stay? And so establishing incentive zones to make sure that as the market changes and shifts, that you still preserve the existing affordability in those properties and provide incentive to maintain that level of affordability. And also how you look at expanding resources and incentives for landlords to also participate to make their market rate and subsidize affordable properties available to existing tenants in the Truckee Meadows, and looking at various market subconditions to see where those markets are changing, and then targeting those for preservations to prevent further displacement. And so some of the things we flagged early on, not only in the strategy roadmap, but in our previous conversations, were 5 or so immediate things that I think have rose to the top in terms of our conversations with the planning structure. One of them is identifying a lead entity to support that. I think those are one of those cross-cutting actions that I think would build capacity of the region if an entity is identified to be the lead, to drive implementation, not sole responsibility for this, but more raise their hand and say, we're going to take on leading this effort. And that's something that has been truly impactful in working with not only the planning structure, but RHA to build the capacity around that and build the momentum behind establishing that lead entity. We recognize that there's been a lot of conversation on dedicating funding for the Region Housing Trust Fund. That's something that I think will be catalytic for the region, and I think something that we've identified as a key priority to support implementation of the entire plan. So it's exciting to see that move forward. I mentioned the preservation early warning system. I mentioned Section 108 financing to bring additional resources to support implementation of this. And I think looking long term, but starting the process now, how do you start looking at establishing those stronger incentives to support something like inclusionary housing that we know will work in certain submarkets within the region? And then finally, so I think we ask that you provide your feedback on the final roadmap or accept it as drafted. And then also support the executive leadership team as well as RHA in ongoing conversations to make sure that this plan moves forward. It's been a lot of feedback and a lot of community support for this. And we want to make sure that this is something that gets implemented in the region, because I think, as you'll see, it lays out a really clear roadmap for how the region can move forward and take advantage of some of the existing tools that the region has, and also build capacity in new tools that I think will make a huge impact in the region. I think one key thing that I think will be helpful to hear feedback on as well is, what is that process that's going to ensure that continued communication and continued coordination throughout the region. And so any guidance you have there, I think, would be huge to make sure that this is something that's sustainable and continues the momentum that has been established to date. So with that, we'll take any questions you have.
All right, thanks very much. Great presentation and exciting roadmap. Questions, comments from the commission? Commissioner Hawkins.
Thank you, Chair Gower. Commissioner Hawkins, I've got something that disturbed me today during my visit with the Reno City Council in their meeting. There was a gentleman that got up for his 3 minutes of talking, and he spent the whole 3 minutes saying he was just kicked out of his apartment. Legally, he'd paid his rent on time, he had a boy, he was disabled, and they were still kicking him out. How does this go on in a civilized world? That bothered the hell out of me. And what happened is the mayor had this gentleman go with Bill Thomas, who's the assistant city manager, go upstairs and do some talking and figuring out. So how do we stand in this society and allow that kind of stuff happens legally? It's beyond me. I need answers.
Sure. And I think strategy area focus number 5 and the 5 actions associated with that action would be something that, if the region moved forwards with those actions, would have prevented potentially that person from being kicked out of their apartment by either providing a tenant-based rental subsidy to allow them to maintain and stay in that property if there was some missed payments or something like that, or lower the rent overall, as well as establishing some policies and tenant protections to prevent something like that from happening in the future. Yep.
Other questions? Commissioner Weisky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chris, this seems to me like it's a form of, or is, government housing, government-funded housing. Is that the way you see this?
No. I think it's publicly supported affordable housing.
Publicly supported, but a lot of what you've suggested here is subsidized through local governments, the city of Sparks, Reno, Washoe County. That's not, I mean, you can call it public, but it's the government that's funding it, right?
Correct.
Okay, and Section 108, that's federally funded housing, right?
It's a federally funded
How
financing
well
mechanism.
did government housing work in Detroit?
I can't answer that question.
It failed.
Yeah. I think there's some market factors that played a large role in that as well.
So how do we work to get housing, whether it be apartments or single-family residence, whatever, at a price break that is affordable? I mean, I didn't see that in the report. Did I miss that somewhere?
No, you didn't. I think the reason it's not in the report is because typically, without public subsidy, you can't lower the price point of development. And I think it takes the public sector's involvement. It takes the public sector financing and resources to lead the way in that regard. So a lot of the strategies and actions that we have are the public sector leading the way, but also in partnership with other partners. But I think the reason why you don't have that is because typically the market doesn't subsidize its own development. It takes some funding source to bring the cost of housing down. And in this case, it's the public sector resources that we've identified.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Chvilcek. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate, I just wanted to compliment the staff for providing a very comprehensive study for us to review, and it's very telling, and it's very, it's well researched and well thought out. So thank you.
Thank you.
If I could just ask either Jim or Sienna, from your perspective, how you see this strategy being taken back to your jurisdictions and kind of carried forward. I'd be curious to get that perspective. And if you don't know, Jim, then you can tell me I don't know.
Okay, Jim Rundle, Planning Manager with the City of Sparks. Armando Ornelas, Deputy Director, has been participating in this. I'm not entirely sure that we support all of the concepts that were proposed today, but we haven't had a formal consideration. It hasn't come in front of our council at this point. I believe that the enterprise team has met with the individual council members, but that's as much as I'd be prepared to say today, Chairman Gower.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Chair, if I may also address that. So we had an executive leadership team that had representation from the 3 jurisdictions in terms of management on that. And part of the conversation that's happening currently is we're presenting the draft to you, to the governing board tomorrow, to get that feedback. And the management for the jurisdictions has also asked to kind of be in the conversation, we're meeting with them tomorrow morning, around how do we move this forward. The expectation is there's a lot of information in here. You know, I don't think anyone expected that all policies or suggestions or ideas would work for every single jurisdiction, and that's part of those conversations that need to happen, what might work where and things like that. So that's also part of that answer, and we're kicking part of that conversation off tomorrow morning at 9:30.
Okay. So I guess what you're looking for from the commission tonight is just kind of an initial gut check of, do we have any concerns or feedback, right?
That is correct.
Knowing that there are going to be these ongoing conversations.
That's correct, because again, the Reno Housing Authority, Reno Sparks, Washoe County, others that are involved in this, there's a lot of voices that have assisted in creating this, and there's a lot of voices that will be required to do implementation work. So tonight, yes, this is the result of the work that Enterprise has done. I think gut check is a great way to describe it, so thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Commissioner
Commissioner, thank you. Chris, got one more question for you. The basis of the information that you've gone back and researched and compiled and brought forward to put this together, is it based upon communities of the size of Washoe County? Can you go into that a little bit for us, please, and the growth patterns that you're seeing and using?
Sure. So I think one of the things that I'll say up front is that we looked at specifically the data as it relates to the Truckee Meadows region, so Washoe County, Reno, and Sparks. The lens we're bringing is a national perspective on best practices of similar sized communities and the challenges they have faced, and overlaying that with understanding the needs in the data, what the data is saying about what's happening in the Truckee Meadows specifically, and then aligning that with what practices would work in this region relative to those market conditions. So that's something that we've done, and many of our housing strategy work as well.
So just to elaborate on that a little bit more, I'm assuming that you've chosen communities of population of the same size and demographics, and I'm assuming that you have chosen economic parameters similar to what we see here in Washoe County also, or the Truckee Meadows area, as far as growth, because we have growth just over the border, as we refer to it sometimes in Story County. But all those factors are what you're bringing forward. Can you give us any insight to what some of those communities might be that are in this national database?
Yeah, I think we looked at definitely cities of similar size to Reno and Sparks, both from being a HUD grantee in terms of the size of allocation that you have and the resource that you have to administer many of the programs and tools that Anna referenced. We also looked at what's happening on a regional scale relative to the Truckee Meadows region as well. So looking at not only, we focus primarily on West Coast, recognizing that there's certain challenges with either development or infrastructure or other things on the West Coast. So looking at cities like Sacramento, in the region that surrounds Sacramento, looking at what's happening in and around Portland and Denver, Utah, and cities in there. I think it's really looking at what are those conditions, but also understanding what are the tools that those regions have today or have developed as a result of those. And so we definitely looked across those and said, we don't want to start the Truckee Meadows region off of where they started 10, 15 years ago in addressing their affordable housing challenge. We want to bring Truckee Meadows into kind of where those lessons learned have landed those communities today, so that we're at a better starting point, but also recognizing that there's that capacity gap, and so we have to build that incrementally. And so we've right-sized this based on not only relative markets, but also relative capacity.
Okay, and the reason I asked that, and you're hitting my points right on, so that's really good. But my concern is that we are not Sacramento, we're not Portland, we're not Denver. We don't have the revenue stream in our tax base that those communities do, because we are 20, 25, 30% of their size. So that's why I'm asking, you know, okay, what areas did you look at so that we could see what their growth is, the things that they did, knowing that they started with a checkbook about the same size as what we have here today?
Right. And I think that's a great point. I think one of the things we've done, and I think you've seen it, or you may not have seen it here, but it's definitely reflected in the document, is we looked at what current resources are available to the region that they could access today. And we have identified some of those low-hanging fruit resources that could be identified. We also looked at what financing could be made available through mechanisms like PACE or the Regional Housing Trust Fund that were an ongoing conversation when we got here. And so we wanted to make sure that we're aligning that conversation and those resources or financing mechanisms. I don't think we've identified anything that hasn't been discussed. We've really just pulled in and said, okay, if you're going to have a regional housing trust fund, this is how you allocate it. There's no dollar amount referenced in this plan to say this is what it should be funded at. I think that those conversations have already happened, or at least started. And so we're really just saying, hey, if you had a fund like that and you allocated X amount of dollars to that, this is how those dollars should be spent to address the needs that are facing the community.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, great questions. Other feedback?
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner
Commissioner Chesney, I'd just like to, I actually read the plan, and it's an outstanding piece of work.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I think what we need to understand is this is not going to happen overnight.
That's right.
That this is going to be a work in progress, and it's a plan. That's just a plan that does not exist today. And if we don't look into affordable housing in the future, we're going to end up just like the San Francisco Bay Area did, promoting the urban sprawl, the inability to transport people from one place to another, and we're going to be so far behind the curve that if we don't at least look at some type of plan, and I think this is a great plan, it's not foolproof, it's not perfect, but it's a start. And that's it. Thank you. Oh, great comments.
Thank you.
Ms. Robinson.
Mr. Chair, if I can provide just some additional information. So the conversation regarding the Reno Housing Authority as the lead entity is actually going to be agendized for the June Reno Housing Authority Board meeting. And we'll see about that conversation. It was very positive yesterday. I wanted to give you some feedback or kind of an explanation of what happens from here. So the document that you have in your packet, the first half, the community profile, is complete. The second half is in a draft form. You'll probably notice that it's mostly words and not a lot of graphics. And that is partly because we are finishing up the draft conversation. We want your feedback. We want the feedback from the governing board, the executive leadership team. As we mentioned, we met with the public staff working group and community leadership today to be able to get their feedback. And then the next part of this job will be to not only create the final document that has more graphics to it, but also an executive summary piece that we will be able to share with everybody that I think clearly identifies those 5 focus areas and where we need to kind of pay attention on what we're working on in the future. So I just wanted to give you that kind of understanding as well.
Great.
Chair?
Commissioner Chesney?
Commissioner Chesney. So would is the proposal that the Reno Housing Authority would eventually become a regional housing authority?
Chris, do you want me to take that one, or do you want to take it?
Sure, why don't you go ahead.
Okay.
I'm throwing it out there. To anybody,
Yeah, anybody?
from the audience, I don't know.
Mr. Chair, if I may. So the conversation is an entity, a lead entity that can talk about housing across with a regional perspective. Let's say that at this point in time. We're in very early days in terms of the conversation. And so, at the moment, the Reno Housing Authority is described in NRS in a very certain way. So Nevada Revised Statutes, excuse me, for those who don't know. And I think the important part here is that there's exploration about what this looks like and what the possibilities are.
Thank you.
Kim, can you just answer one more question and just explain the nexus? Oh, Jim, I'm sorry.
Through the chair, Jim Rundle, Planning Manager with Sparks. To an extent, the Reno Housing Authority already is regional. Sparks provides money as a subrecipient to the Reno Housing Authority to do certain components. Community assistance centers are all, Sparks provides money to the Reno Housing Authority, which funds the homeless center, the community assistance center, and NAM's campus, all these different things. So I just wanted to make the point that it is regional in nature. It's just called the Reno Housing Authority. And since they have the largest population, they're the lead agency on that. But it is provided revenue from all three jurisdictions.
Great. Commissioner Funes?
Thank you, Chairman Gower, excuse me. On slide 5, it said protect residents from housing displacement. On 5.3, it says development of tenant bill of rights. I know in the state legislature, it didn't make it out of the floor, or it kind of failed. Should we put something in there that's, since it is a regional plan, that we've obviously direction on this legislative session that kind of said no on that? Is that valid to even put it in a regional plan when the state's probably going to trump it?
So yeah.
I'll just jump in on this one because I've been talking a bit with Washoe Legal Services about this one. And to clarify, this is not creating new rights. It's only making it easier for tenants and landlords to understand the existing rights that the state has granted to them. So just right now, the NRS, frankly, is a little hard to get through if you're not spending a lot of time in it. So we talked with Washoe Legal Services about the potential for them to develop a much more concise document that just lays out so that upon lease up and upon a tenant moving in or even applying, they would know more clearly what their rights are. So like the gentleman that Mr. Hawkins referenced might have a little stronger information much more early on in the process rather than waiting, when there's about 5 to 7 days between notice of eviction and point of eviction. That's a really tough amount of time to figure out all your rights and then move forward on them. So it's more of an informational piece, and then there are options if local jurisdictions wished to, you could require that that document is provided at a certain point. Or it could just be an informational piece that Washoe Legal Services supports the jurisdictions in promoting.
Mr. Chair.
Yep, Commissioner Vanderbilt.
Chris, I just have a really quick question. On the 108 funding, in your research, did you find out if City of Sparks or City of Reno have ever applied for that type of funding?
Yes, I believe they have. I believe the city of Reno has.
Okay, terrific. And then I wanted to share with my fellow commissioners, I have sat on the community working group for the last 2 years for this. And so we see a snapshot of here. I am sitting with a group of people where we've got developers, we have community agencies. So what this has done is we have brought everyone to the table to ask them for their opinion and how they want to see it happen. So I wanted to share that. So we do have developers at the table, and so when we're saying, developers are saying, I want affordable housing, or I can build affordable housing, on one hand, they're saying they can do that, but on the other hand, they're saying, but I want you to subsidize me to do it. So that's where a lot of these conversations on housing trust funds and trying to find federal funds and everything else to trickle down to our local governments in order to have developers that will build affordable housing.
Thank you.
Okay, well, that's great discussion. Do you need a motion on this to advance comments to the governing board?
Mr. Chair, that is your choice. If you would like to do that, you can certainly provide that tonight. We can also take your feedback and work with that in terms of the document yourself. This is definitely a planning commission choice.
Okay, well, let's make it a motion then. Who wants to make it? Commissioner Chesney.
Commissioner Chesney here. I move to accept the report and provide the following feedback from our discussion tonight, and provide the following information or suggestions to the Regional Planning Governing Board.
Wonderful. Thank you. Have a motion? Do I have a second? Okay, Commissioner Peterson, motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? If not, all those in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Thank you. Commissioner Javilcek in favor also. Thank you very much for being
Thank
here
you.
for the presentation.
Appreciate
Really
it.
appreciate it.
Thank you for your feedback.
Okay, we will move on then to item 5B, presentation regarding the Truckee Meadows Regional Plan update. Lauren, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioners, for the record, Lauren Knox with Regional Planning. So I'm just going to provide a very brief update on where we're at with the 2019 Regional Plan update. So since our last Regional Planning Commission meeting, we've been working with the Regional Plan Update Working Group through that list of controversial items. We're really right now focused on that regional form map and the associated densities and intensities that go with those regional land use designations. We are actually close to landing on the third draft of the regional form map, and all parties are seeming to come to a consensus. So we're pretty excited about that. We're making some great headway. Through that discussion, we're actually going to be able to check off a lot of those controversial items that were on that list that you've seen. So we're making great headway there. Our next conversation really with the update working group beyond the regional form discussion is then really diving into those public facilities and services. So that's kind of our next step with that piece. We are also internally working on continuing those narrative portions of the plan and getting the rest of those pieces all kind of together. So with that, a brief update. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Great, thanks very much for the update. Questions for Lauren? All right, seeing none, thanks. Move on then to 6A, members and directors reports.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
Just quickly pointing out, your next Planning Commission meeting will be June 12th, and it will be held at the Sparks Council Chambers. And then after that, we'll be meeting again July 10th, and that will be here in the Washoe County Commission Chambers. Thank you.
Excellent. 6B, legal counsel report. All right, thanks very much. Item 7, request for future agenda items. Okay, seeing none, public comment? All right, no public comment, any written correspondence?
There is none?
Okay, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn then. All right, lots of motions. How about a second? Good night.